What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, guys? It's Maddy Hudak back here. I apologize for this episode coming out a day later than usual. Such is life in general, but especially in the off season, one that feels similar but different, if that makes sense. I've very much settled into just kind of covering college football, and that's kind of been a journey over the last couple of seasons for me, where I started off in this industry covering the Saints, and with them moving their training camp out to Irvine, California, that pretty much ixnays me covering their training camp next season. There's still OTAs, rookie mini camp. I'll see about those things, but it's genuinely difficult to dedicate that much time and attention to two separate leagues. And, when I started off in this industry, I had a lot of random side jobs, but they were all NFL focused. Even though I did some fantasy based work, which personally is not for me, just because I can't just write something without doing 4 hours of research. And the time and the payoff was not there for me. All that to say, it was all in the same realm. And up until I became the sideline reporter for Tulane, I really didn't pay attention to college football whatsoever outside of following who the Saints were picking up in the draft, or just how, the draft was going, just that kind of general thing. And I've noticed now that watching the draft last year and actually having, some emotional stake, for lack of a better term, in players getting drafted that, I've watched again grow as people and as players. And to see Tajay Spears and Dorian Williams both get drafted in the third round last year was incredible. But I was very stressed out watching the draft. And it probably also comes from the fact that I have the ability to immerse myself in so much of college football, from the team at Tulane, the season, everything that goes on with their offseason, which I'm kind of going to talk about today. This is a smorgasbord episode. But those events like the Senior Bowl that are extremely open with their media access, it happens to be within driving distance from New Orleans. So if they moved it elsewhere, that would be a different story, but makes it very easy to go down there, especially when, there's been 2 seasons running now that there have been 2 Tulane players there. Unfortunately, I won't be at the combine. My goal is to go there someday, but I will again be covering Tulane's Pro Day. More on that to come down the pipeline. But being able to be a part of the broadcast on ESPN Plus last year, it really made me have to appreciate what Pro Day and all those drills really mean, and the significance of them, and explaining them in a way that it was interesting, when you could easily go into watching paint dry territory talking about 40-yard times. But that's again where I feel that my time as a sideline reporter, being able to see these guys and just have so much information on them, between Corey Glore and myself, just the storytelling ability was really easy there. And again, I expect that to continue this year, but it did give me an appreciation, especially writing an article on Nick Anderson throughout that process last year, watching one of the Pro Day workouts that Kurt Hester, the prior strength and conditioning coach, was helping these guys get ready for Pro Day. And it does seem very absurd that these guys spend their entire lives, and especially the last 3-4 years of it, delving into playbooks, learning schemes, learning techniques, learning fundamentals, learning football skills, learning football IQ related things, working on their mental processing, working on the transition from college to the NFL, and having all of those traits and what have you. But hold on one second, y'all. Lost the train of thought. You all know what happens here, and it'll be back shortly. Alas, the thought did not come back. Again, when I lack a schedule and lack practice and just sit here with my brain, that's what tends to happen. But talking about learning is spending your entire life learning the game of football, well, then you suddenly have to really check out of that. And it just struck me, again, when I was interviewing Nick for this article last year as well, just hearing about how much time he'd spent working on opening up his hips in order to get a higher vertical jump, and what the small kind of technique and fundamental changes that are necessary to jump as high as you can in the air, when in football, you're not really doing that all of the time. Now you can see why it matters more for certain positions. And that's really where I find, there to be interest in breaking down these drills is it's a lot more valuable to see what, the high point of a wide receiver or a defensive back is, because that plays into ball skills at the defensive back level, the ability to make interceptions, force fumbles, knock down passes in the air, just disrupt the pass. And there's a reason that prototypes exist. And unfortunately, again, there are some times where Nick Anderson is an example, although he's not counted out yet, and just how hard it is when you don't have all of the requisite size traits, all of those kind of baseline athleticism things, because what you see a lot more in the NFL, and it's not necessarily longevity for your career, but I think there are a lot of guys that kind of get by in the first couple of years in the NFL. There's not that much tape on them. They have a ton of gas in their tank, and they're just such physical freaks. And I mean that in the best way possible, that their path from point A to point B might be inefficient. And this all ties into, a lot of the heart of what I do on the show, mental processing, how people can have defects in a lot of those areas, and then you can overcompensate for them by having other characteristics. Having good physical attributes really helps you out in that nature, where even if you're not taking the best path, because you're so quick, because you have such strong hands and are able to use them violently if you're in the pass rush, for example, that all matters a lot more. It just kind of comes down to what those traits are that they're looking for. And, if you have that baseline, then can you stand out? Because you have to just essentially be exceptional if you don't meet those requisite requirements. And unfortunately, it's just a very sobering reality in the NFL in general. And, what I continue to say when people ask me about where I project guys to get drafted, I honestly, in speaking about all this, I don't have the time to delve into the needs of all 32 NFL teams, the coaching staffs of all of these teams, especially with all of the carousels and jumping around, both for, play callers and offensive coordinator, head coaching changes, all of the position group changes, to where I don't know. And fit is more important than anything else, but I just don't know if I'm able to evaluate that on the outside. And again, that's just why when I talk about these guys from Tulane, it's more of a trait based, what I've been able to see, and what I can speak to from the quote intangibles perspective. That some people don't like using that term, but I have yet to find one that is a proper synonym for everything that you're trying to say there. This episode is a little chaotic, if not evidenced by the way that I've introed it. But again, we're kind of in this dead period where Tulane, there's workouts going on, but we don't really see anything until spring camp starts, which I believe is March 12th, if I have it in my head correctly, with the spring game being April 20th. Then you have Pro Day on the 26th. And so there's a lot going on here. I should probably know the date of the NFL Combine, so I'm going to quickly look that up right now. It is next weekend. That's what I thought. So, Tulane has Jaquan Jackson, Michael Pratt, and Prince Pines, which is the highest representative of all G5 schools, going to the Combine this year. And there were quite a bit of snubs. There are a ton of guys on Tulane's roster last year that I could see a little more hesitancy on drafting some of these guys after just that one-off year. But when you look at the level of competition that overall Tulane has played against the last 2 seasons, and I talk about this with Michael Pratt. I did this episode during my time at the Senior Bowl, where I talked about those real moments of competition where it's against Power 5 quality opponents and they're considered quality wins. You still were a team coming off of a 2-10 year. And I think just the element of surprise helped Tulane get to the end of the rope, but it ultimately was still, I think, hard for people to grasp that all of a sudden Tulane was somewhere where you should be looking at these guys as legitimate NFL prospects. Whereas I think these guys this year are going to benefit a little bit from that perception. I talked about this when I went on WDSU with Sharif, doing Game On when I was down at the Senior Bowl, where again, the fact that Dorian Williams and Tajay Spears performed how they did at the Senior Bowl, that led to them getting invites to the Combine, and then them getting drafted both in the 3rd round, both highest players since Matt Forte in 2008, and then actually playing on Sundays considerably, especially in the case of Tajay Spears. that I just look at perceptions and biases. And that's something that now that I'm going back through the scouting academy, I'm trying to get the couple first weeks of just fundamentals back in my head because it's been so long. And one of their big things is being aware of all of the cognitive biases that everyone as people are going to hold, which has always resonated for me. Being a psychology major, having that background, I always try to at least be aware of those types of things. And so I do think that there is that kind of potential, but there's also just more game tape. And even though, again, Tulane lost against Ole Miss, even though Michael Pratt didn't play, there were still players in that game that had it a 3-point game until there were 2 minutes left in regulation. And I think you would consider, UTSA last year to be a quality opponent, but I don't think these guys really had anything left to prove this season. It's just, to me, as, an insider looking outward, if you will, I'm going to be really curious to see, again, just the attention paid to these guys, where I do think that there is an obvious pattern, a pipeline between getting invited to the Senior Bowl to the Combine and how that really works out for you. Because historically, looking at Tulane players that have been drafted and stuck with teams, most of them were invited to the Combine more often than the Senior Bowl, although most of the time that kind of leads to a yes type thing. And so Jaquan Jackson, Michael Pratt, both benefiting from that week down in Mobile. And compared to Pro Day, where every player is able to participate and it's a different setup, there's a voting system that goes on in the NFL. I was kind of looking into this. They hire these national scouting services specifically for this combine related process as well, but teams vote at the beginning of the year and then at the end, presumably after the Senior Bowl, based again on how that performance often leads to those invites. And obviously that's the marquee invite, but there's only so many guys that can be invited to the combine. And it's certainly a lot less guys than all 7 rounds of the NFL draft. And even though it's easier said than done, making it on a roster as an undrafted free agent, the first step is getting onto a roster. And then it's really up to you. And I think mental toughness comes in there. I think, again, a willingness to be a role player, to perform as a special teams guy and excel at that. Like we've seen how Dorian Williams got onto the field this last season, despite being this hard-hitting linebacker I watched for 2 seasons, he made his mark on special teams, but that's what gets you onto a roster a lot of the time in the NFL. And that was something that Jaquan Jackson at the Senior Bowl, they were working him out in that aspect. The benefit of the combine is, though, that's another round of interviews for these guys, which is super critical for some. I was watching this, I subscribe to some of these Coach Tube websites, and I try to just look at, again, successful coaches. And so looking at a question and answer with Nick Saban, and something really stuck out to me where he was talking about being an and player and not a but player, where all of the traits, great speed, change of direction, ability to flip his hips, remain in phase and man coverage, great ball skills, tracking ability, comes down and run support. And he's a leader. He was on SEC's leadership council. He was a team captain. Or you have all of the traits that I previously described, but has DUI charges, has character issues, failed a drug test, getting a little more into the weeds with, some worse stuff like domestic violence, where it comes to a point of, is it worth drafting this player? And what I will continue to say about Tulane guys is that's not a worry at all. If anything, I think character is every single guy that's come out of Tulane since I've been around's best trait. And so that really shines in those interview processes. But it also goes to say that I think there are a lot of guys that those interview processes are make or break when you're in that but category. But if you're firmly in the and category, all it takes is one team to like you. There are top 30 visits, which each team gets 30 of their top prospects to be able to come in and do the full medical evaluation, because that's the other thing that really stands out about the combine is you go through that full medical evaluation and teams really get that information on the players that they've hopefully voted in and are seeking that out on. But Pro Day, I think, plays a lot more into players' strengths. And obviously that's taken into account, and as well as the timing differences oftentimes with the stopwatch versus the electric timer. I just think there's something to be said about comfortability and being in your own space, having your quarterback throw you the drills, or, whether or not Michael Pratt participates in Pro Day, Kai Horton and Carson Haggard were the ones throwing it last year. And I remember them specifically saying that, they try not to get a guy who's trying out in that same aspect, because the quarterback's really there to make the wide receiver's job easier. You see at combine workouts all the time, quarterbacks just throwing darts that go flying through receivers' hands because they're also trying to benefit themselves. Another thing to point out about Michael Pratt, he's very good at making everyone around him look very good as well. And so if he participates in pro day, absolutely not worried about that factor. But, just thinking about all of those things versus being in an unfamiliar environment. And yeah, that's life. And that's going to be what the NFL is like as well, where you're going to be with a group of strangers in an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar coaches telling you what to do. And the spotlight is all on you. And so it is important, especially for the guys that are there, that now can be compared to the other guys that are in attendance at their position at the same, level, be it G5, group of five, what have you. They all have that opportunity there, but I think pro day allows them to really just be themselves. And that's super important to me. Some guys just aren't going to relax. And I'm not saying that that's the case for any of these Tulane guys, but as someone that is, an introverted person that is comfortable in my own setting, it's very easy for me to feel like I'm a fish out of water when I'm in an overwhelming new type of environment. And I think you see a little bit of that shell shock at the Senior Bowl the first day, including just how messy it is. Again, just the cohesiveness of pro day in comparison to everything we're talking about, where you're familiar with at least usually the strength and conditioning coach running it, but you're there with your teammates, you're there on the turf that you played your final games in, and that type of stuff matters. Even just thinking about when I took the SAT, taking all my practice tests out at a facility at the exact same time that I would be taking the test for when my date came. Yeah, obviously I wasn't able to sit in that same classroom, but that kind of repetition of things and that comfortability, it allows you to just, I think, forget about a lot and just play your best ball. And that's where you also have the position group coaches be able to really work these guys out. And I think a lot of the time, guys might be good role players that are coming out of these schools, but it's all kind of about that mentality and making the most of those types of opportunities. Pro day to me is something that you might not be an obvious NFL starter, but you've seen injuries plague every position in the NFL, plague teams just with really bad luck, all the quarterback injuries this year, all that to say, you can't just have your starters and be done with it. And what I've learned through the scouting academy as well is when teams are looking at free agents, which, we're looking at NFL players just because that's the evaluation course that I'm taking, but it's the same aspect as signing a draftee. What's the role? What is the purpose? Do you need them to be a starter? Are they a day one starter? You hear all the time about year one versus year three starters, having those kind of more developmental guys. And those guys are super valuable. And that's not to say that they're useless until year three. But when I talk about fit and why it's so difficult for me to answer that question, that's really where it comes down to me. But I do think that a lot of guys just check out when they don't get invited to the big dance. And I don't think that you're going to see that out of any of these Tulane guys. And you also saw Dorian Williams and Tajay Spears both participate in pro day last year, because you do have an extra month or so in order to work on your 40 times and then do those specialized workouts. And that really, I think, is what made a difference both for Tajay Spears and Dorian Williams, where I went back and watched some of the broadcasts from last year, and it just stuck out to me that we ran so late because all of these position groups coaches wanted to do linebacker coverage drills with Dorian Williams and Nick Anderson. I was trying to parse through the footage to see if I could find, a Bills scout or coordinator talking specifically to Dorian Williams, but all 32 NFL teams were in attendance last year. But especially considering that he broke his wrist at the Senior Bowl, and that was really the first time they were getting to show off those skills again, it just stuck out to me how deliberate, measured, and lengthy all of the evaluations were. And yes, the Saints didn't end up drafting Tajay Spears, but the workouts Joel Thomas put him through certainly showcased the skills that easily got him drafted on the Titans, who are also the coaches down there in Mobile for that Senior Bowl week. All this to say, you're never really going to know when it clicks for a team. And there are definitely easier pathways when you get invited to the big dance. But what I've enjoyed the most, again, about covering these Tulane guys is watching how great their character, their toughness, and their leadership is, and how much that overcomes so many of these other things. But all of these guys coming into the draft this year are just so quality, both in play and in people. And I know I'm going to forget a ton of guys, but just thinking, about those snubs, if you will, Jarius Monroe, Lance Robinson, Sincere Haynesworth, just three off the top of my head. And I know I'm forgetting some obvious ones, which is why I'm just going to end it on there. I can name the entirety of the secondary though, but all of that to say, we saw the same thing last year. We saw quality prospects work out at Pro Day last year. And another thing that they benefit from, and I think you see these guys get invited to the Saints facility more. It's just something to keep in mind that, and I don't really understand this rule. All of this to say, I'll be done with my word vomiting here on this whole process, but this is just kind of how I think about these things. All teams, if they're within 50 miles of a college, those players don't count towards their top 30 visits. So all of these guys, I remember a lot of them getting invited to the Saints facility last year for that. And I'm completely speculating here, but I do tend to think that there's definitely a lot of gatekeeping in the scouting community, but you have to make those relationships. And I think that there's a lot more information sharing than might be obvious. And I think it's in those situations where, you might be looking for a certain need and someone else kind of brings that across to you. But knowing also, it just makes me think, because if I were teams, I would be trying to exploit the hell out of that rule where, I would, maybe this is illegal. I know illegal is not the term. And this is really Maddy after dark right now. But, if I was NFL teams, I'd be looking for every school within a few miles and befriending one of those scouts to send me that information, because it just seems like such a wild advantage to me, but also just such a ridiculous potential difference maker. You think of Kenny Pickett going to the Steelers, them drafting him in the first round. It's not working great over there, but I remember it stuck out to me that they would go watch his practice all the time. The Steelers facility was right there. And so to have that not count against that visit, but also I think that just allows teams to get tunnel vision more often than not. And then it just kind of, do you happen to be geographically based somewhere where a team, you fit their scheme, you fit their idea of what a player is going to be looking like, you fit their needs in this upcoming draft. Again, it just stuck out to me how difficult it truly is to make it to that next level. But when I continue to go throughout learning how to scout players and learning what they can and cannot do, you can see a lot of what I think people consider intangibles, like leadership, mental toughness, those types of things. You could see them on game film, but I think you really see a different side of these guys when you strip it all down and they just have to perform these workouts in a way that feels very much to me, and I continue to say this, like the SAT, where can you just amass all of this random knowledge that might push you over the edge one way or another? Obviously, for those guys that are going on to the combine, it's a lot easier for them. But when you see that all 32 teams were at Tulane's Pro Day last year, that was a first in school history. And you saw the guys that went to the Senior Bowl, that went to the combine, participate in Pro Day, get drafted and play in the NFL. It just makes that spotlight that much bigger. And with all of the buzz towards Tulane as a separate program right now, because these guys are ultimately moved on. But again, I'm in this kind of period of, should I be breaking down Tulane's team? Should I be breaking down these guys going on to the draft? And so we're kind of doing a potpourri of everything between on this episode, but that's just a little delving into my brain on my thoughts on Pro Day, the combine, how bizarre all of this really is. And does feel kind of like a circus, but there doesn't seem to be a better alternative. And I just have to say that covering it from the college side, it just has made the stakes definitely feel a lot higher, because you realize that these are guys that, their lives are changing, their families are changing. When I talk to these guys about how draft day went for them, waiting for that phone call, it does carry a different weight on this side of the coin. But I just think that the storytelling and the ability to watch these guys go on, chase their dreams, and recognize so many guys, even just coming from opponents that Tulane's played in the NFL, has definitely been a really cool experience over these last 2 years. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid to. Well, if you know me at all, then you know two things. One, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And two, if I were in it for the money, well, then I'd certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak BBQ, and I am much overdue for a trip back there to have some of the food, the drinks, the people, the location. Yes, all of that. Blue Oak BBQ has a great selection of your favorites, from the smoker, fantastic sides, and I continue to say awesome bar specials each and every week. Go check them out. Blue Oak BBQ, 9100 North Carrollton Avenue here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbbq.com. And I do have those February specials for you guys, even though we are in a short month here. Let's make the most of it. And I know that my episode is coming out later this week, so have these in mind for your next slate week here at Blue Oak BBQ. But Mondays, got the classic red beans and rice. Tuesdays, brisket barbacoa tacos. Thank you for that tongue twister. Wednesdays is the master burger. Thursdays, bloke potato, which I'm as curious about as y'all are. And Fridays, you have a fried catfish banh mi. I will get y'all those weekend specials on Friday's episode. I know that I've basically rambled on for essentially 20 minutes, and I'm going to try not to repeat myself here because there's quite a bit of off season here to be had, but it just has been very, again, I continue to say this, but very special to me that I have the ability to have this podcast, have this space, and be able to storytell on guys that I just get to know so well over the course of their college careers, and that I continue to see them living out their dreams in the NFL. That, I'm still looking forward to seeing this whole offseason out. I'm going to have some players on, especially some of those guys that I think deserve that spotlight heading into the draft this year. Because now is kind of that time for that. I always try to be very mindful about what is best for people that I'm trying to interview, especially when looking at players, what timeline is kind of best for them. And so a little bit in this dead period where pro day is not until March 26th. And outside of those three guys going to the combine, you kind of just have to put your head down and work on your craft. And again, that mental toughness, that focus, that Tulane character really comes out. And just kind of ending this with, again, my thoughts on this new era of Tulane football and continuing to dive into that as the weeks go on. Nothing has happened since signing day, and I still want to look into these players. I know that I can watch their huddle highlights, and this is me reminding myself to kind of do that. But I'm just going to be really curious because these last couple of seasons, it's been these leaders at the top, a really player-led team with Nick Anderson, Dorian Williams, Michael Pratt, and Sincere Haynesworth, all of those captains in the 12-2 season. But having that consistency of Willie Fritz and knowing that, he had a culture that he was building, he had a vision, one that, again, if you read the article I wrote on Nick Anderson during the draft last year, he talks about Willie Fritz sharing that vision with him. And you don't really need to look farther than Nick Anderson to see the pinnacle of that Tulane character. So you do have to give a lot of that. If not, that's where Willie Fritz's legacy, I think for me, really comes into play here. And just the professionalism of these guys. I've talked about how much it just seemed like Jaquan Jackson and Michael Pratt both really were just grown men at the Senior Bowl. And how much that tiny bit of offseason can make a difference. So we are heading into a new era at Tulane where there is a new philosophy. There's a new coaching staff. There is a new scheme. And there were some of those elements last year when you look at the fact that there was a new offensive coordinator, a new defensive coordinator, several position group changes, coaching changes at that. But you still had the leadership of Willie Fritz. You had the continuity of Slade Nagel being around the program for as long as Willie Fritz. So stepping into that job at the top. And so really the newest thing to me was looking at, new defensive coordinator and seeing how that kind of worked out. But you also had that core group of guys. You had an O-line with a ton of returnee guys. You had Michael Pratt. You had those receivers, Jaquan Jackson, Lawrence Keys, Chris Brazel, all coming back, Alex Bauman. Really, I could name off, again, just a bunch of playmaker guys where we were really focused in the offseason on looking at linebacker, at least for me, and covering the running back competition, if you will, where you knew that Tulane's offense was steady. And so I think you just kind of paid less attention to it. At least I did. But now, who is the leader on offense? Who is the leader? I think you could answer Tyler Grubbs at linebacker being one of those leaders on defense, but they lost a lot of those vocal leaders, especially at the defensive back position. That is just going to be a fascinating one to me to watch this turnaround. But knowing that JJ McCleskey is still with this team and being able to sit in on some of the meetings that he held and just seeing how great of a teacher he is, that's really the most important thing. Is you might be a great coach, but are you a really good teacher? Because everything else does not matter if you cannot. And I take this from my time in jury consulting, where you can have the best legal argument in the world. If you cannot break it down in an understandable way and in a way that people care about, then it doesn't matter that you graduated top of your class from Harvard Law. And it doesn't matter whether or not, again, that you broke this code, at least you think, legally speaking, if you're speaking a foreign language to a group of regular people on the jury. In that same note, you can be the best scheme magician ever, but can you break it down for guys? Can you get them to understand it? Can you get them to care about their role in that system if that's how it kind of works? So a buy-in where it's a, Tulane's been known for its brotherhood for the last couple of seasons. And I think you still definitely see those traits running through. And I think, again, that culture, identity, legacy, it still remains. But this to me is the first real test of that, because coaching staff is gone. All of those leaders that we've talked about, gone. There are guys that I know are likely to step up. They're already there, but there are so many guys coming in that I have yet to see work with their teammates. I just remember going to the Great Surge event Kurt Hester put on last June, which was a very deranged version of essentially field day, but with very heavy weights and a lot of vomiting because it was very, very hot in June in New Orleans. But you really got to see how guys competed with each other. If they got emotional in those moments, that was just very fascinating to watch people's true competitive nature come out and how they work with a different, it wasn't based on position group. It wasn't based on anything to do with football whatsoever. And I just think those small details are ultimately going to be what matters in this turnover of Tulane system. Just thinking back to the Super Bowl, we can go over strategy and how important it was that players knew or didn't knew the overtime rules were different. And again, when we talk about bias, it's hard for me to separate myself from the euphoria of the Houston overtime win in 2022 and understand anything about a coach deciding to take the ball first in overtime when the other team has a guaranteed opportunity to potentially win the game. And anyone in today's NFL should know that a team is not going to just kick the extra point after doing all of that, having their defense get presumably burned in a touchdown in the first round, and then expect them to hold the ensuing team to a field goal. That's where you're going to win and lose it on the 2-point conversion. All of that to say, the fact that the Chiefs players were all bored of the overtime rules by the time they got to the actual big stage, because they had been practicing it every single day since preseason. Maybe not every single day, but that was brought up that early in meetings. It was very alarming to watch the mic'd up version of the Super Bowl and see hear 49ers players saying, oh, well, if they, if we score a touchdown, it's over. No, it's not over. This is the new overtime rules. You think about these dynasties in the NFL, if you will. There have been two things: great quarterback play, very hard to separate. I'm just talking about the Patriots and the Chiefs at this point, modern speaking. Hard to separate the greatness of Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes from everything there, but it's not a coincidence that these teams keep getting back to and winning the biggest game that there is in football, and one that is just notoriously hard to even sniff, let alone get as close as teams do, losing in that championship round. But to get there and not have thought of every single possibility. We talk about these kind of insane ideas that coaches have, like Sean Payton and the onside kick ambush in that Super Bowl, but meticulous detail, every possession. How do we steal possession? Everything being accounted for, and the players being well aware of that early on before you get to the big stage and potentially have them get stage fright. That was just very, very surprising to me. That's going to be something that will be the most important thing to me, is the little things. And I will at least, not that this has been a negative episode, I'm getting ahead of myself, but ending this really just on a positive note, what I'm going to continue diving into, just looking at this philosophy from the outside in until I have a chance to really see these coaches work, just continues to stand out to me that in his introductory press conference, taking the job at Tulane, John Summerall not only had, the confidence to call out essentially Tulane for not being that with football in the past, he talked about the little details and the fact that the team ran over the home bench was previously on the opposite side of Yeoman Stadium that opening year. Granted, there's a lot more shade on that side, but to his point, why are we running out away from our fans? It's those little things. And when you're real football guys, it just seems like all of these things should be a given. And so to hear those things be brought up again in an introductory press conference where you're putting your best foot forward, he did so in a way that said, we have a standard here. And to be honest, it didn't really feel like it was getting met when I was previously on this coaching staff. And as a student that was here during that time, I can continue to attest that no one cared about football. Everyone cares about football. Everyone really cares about Tulane athletics right now. And that synergy is very noticeable. But, we talk about how juiced up we are for this new regime, if you will. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how the little details really get hammered out, how we pay attention to how these guys are as teammates. I think about John Summerall bringing up the fact that he wanted to call Bo Nix and his adoptive brother at Oregon to see them on, a physical video interacting with Ty Thompson, one of the new quarterbacks at Tulane. He's the only new one, but presumed potentially the starter. I'm getting ahead of myself, but all that to say, he just wanted to see how he was as a teammate in a genuine setting with guys that he plays with all the time, not how he's going to be with, his new group of guys, which that leadership is extra important. But some guys, when they're comfortable, are you still your best self, essentially? And the overwhelming answer there was yes. So I think it's a really exciting time where that legacy of culture and quality, hearing John Summerall emphasize that it's not just about the best players, that it's about the best fit, and that they had their pick of the litter at quarterback, and that Ty Thompson was the best fit for the culture, for the city, for the team. That is just detail after detail after detail that is getting hammered out here. And I'm looking forward to breaking these down throughout this season or off season, if you will, on Before the Whistle. And with that, y'all, I will see you on Friday.